You're listening to a dramatized investigation, the kind you can let run in the background while your mind does the real work. And it begins the way all dangerous questions begin, with a photograph that refuses to behave. The image is dated somewhere in the 1870s, sepia, soft around the edges, a street scene that looks ordinary until your eyes settle on the building its center frame. It's a civic-looking structure, stone facade, symmetrical, a proud row of arched windows, except the lowest row isn't a row at all. Those windows are buried. Half of each arch is swallowed by earth like the building is sinking into the ground, and the people standing nearby, tiny silhouettes with hats, look like they're posed beside a giant's toy. The doors are too tall. Not grand, not ceremonial, but tall in a way that makes your stomach tighten, because the proportions don't flatter the human body, they ignore it. And right there, before you can talk yourself out of it, the old question crawls out of the dust. Why do so many 19th century photos show windows in the ground, staircases descending into what should be basements, and main entrances that seem designed for someone who didn't need to duck? The official story arrives on schedule, as it always does, polished and comforting. Cities raised their street levels, they say. Mud and debris accumulated. Renovations happened. Architecture was fashionable. They'll tell you it's all mundane, flooding, landscaping, urban renewal, maybe a railroad project that forced the street to be graded higher. But the photo doesn't feel mundane, and the more you stare, the more your brain begins to do what it was trained not to do. Compare scale, trace lines, notice what isn't said. Look at the masonry. The stone courses align perfectly across the buried arches, as if those windows were always meant to be exposed. The soil line cuts through the architecture like a knife. There is no crude retaining wall, no patchwork of later brick, no messy adaptation that screams "we raised the ground after." It's too clean, too consistent. The building doesn't look like it was partly buried, it looks like it was interrupted. Like a chapter was ripped out mid-sentence. And then you notice the street itself. No piles of excavated dirt, no fresh grading scars, no chaos of construction. It's just there. A calm scene after a catastrophe that nobody is naming. Because if this were ordinary street raising, where is the evidence of the work? Where are the temporary staircases, the braced facades, the uneven transitions from one building to the next? Instead, you get uniformity, whole blocks sharing the same half-buried lower story, as if the city collectively decided to hide a floor in perfect synchrony. Official historians will say basements were always basements, and yet these basements have ornate window frames, decorative keystones, and sometimes exterior entrances so dignified that they could have been the true front door. They'll say people were shorter, as if that alone explains why doors loom like cathedral portals. But human height isn't a magic wand that resizes architecture without leaving other clues. Proportions tell the truth, and the proportions in that photograph whisper something else. This building was built for a different normal. The detective work starts in the details that sound boring until there aren't. Thresholds, stair risers, handrails, the height of a doorknob relative to a human elbow. In the photo, a man stands near the buried arches. If you assume he's around 170 centimeters, typical for the era in many places, then the visible portion of the basement window is already shoulder high. That means the full arch, if uncovered, would be towering. Not impossible, but unnecessary. unless the room behind it was not a basement, unless what we call ground level today is actually a second act built on top of the first. And if that's true here, it might be true elsewhere, because it is elsewhere. You can take this same anomaly, half windows, sunken floors, doors that look like they belong to a temple, and you'll find it in cities that never shared a single engineer, never shared a single floodplain, and never coordinated a single street raising project together. St. Petersburg, Chicago, London, Boston, Naples, Buenos Aires, Calcutta. You can scroll through archives and feel that eerie repetition, the same buried arches, the same clipped facades, the same suspicious uniformity that makes coincidence feel like a story someone wants you to stop reading. Different languages, different governments, different climates, and yet the same architectural bruise. And that's the first time the phrase global reset stops sounding like a slogan and starts sounding like a hypothesis. Not a belief, not a religion, just a working model that fits the evidence better than the official shrug. Now, if you've watched enough of this world to know how it works, you can predict the next move. The authorities won't argue the details, they'll attack the frame. They'll call it conspiracy, pseudoscience, internet mythology, and then they'll offer you a neat little psychological box to sit in. But the box doesn't explain why the anomalies cluster around the same time window. The box doesn't explain why the photographs bloom in the mid-1800s, why the repairs and renovations intensify after, and why the documentation feels strangely thin before. The box doesn't explain the second thread we're about to pull, one that doesn't live in stone, but in ink. The abrupt shift in recorded human stature after the 1850s. This is where the story gets uncomfortable, because it stops being about a weird building and becomes about bodies, about numbers, about institutions that measure you and file you away. In military lists, recruitment records, medical examinations, prison registries, places where height becomes a data point, there are patterns that don't sit still. Not everywhere, not uniformly, not in a way you can summarize with a single headline, but in a way that's jagged, abrupt, strange. You see tall outliers in earlier lists that later become rare, and you see averages that seem to compress, then slowly creep back up in the 20th century as nutrition improves. The official narrative says malnutrition, industrial hardship, poverty, measurement inconsistencies. And yes, those factors matter. Critical thinking demands we admit that. But what if those explanations are only part of the picture? What if the environment itself changed, and the change forced biology to negotiate with new rules? Imagine a world where atmospheric pressure shifts, where the density of air alters, where the subtle relationship between oxygen availability, skeletal load, and cardiovascular strain changes over a generation. Imagine gravity not as a constant you can treat like wallpaper, but as a variable in a system you don't fully control. You don't need science fiction to admit that bodies respond to pressure and load. You can feel it when you climb mountains, when you dive underwater, when you live at altitude. The body is an adaptation machine. So here's the heretical question. What if something happened in the 19th century? Call it the mud flood, call it the Great Reset, call it the Big Dump, the Great Displacement, the event with 100 names that didn't just bury streets, but altered the weight of the world. What if the planet's near-surface environment shifted, and the old giants, whether literal giants or simply a class of exceptionally large-bodied humans, found themselves in a world that became heavy, hostile to their scale? In that model, the disappearance of the giants isn't fantasy, it's a biological consequence. The tallest bodies become unsustainable. The outliers vanish first. The average compresses, and within a couple of generations, the records look normal again. Normal for the new regime. That's where the third thread enters: technology. Because if there was a pre-reset world that built on different assumptions, it likely used different systems to harvest energy, move materials, and shape cities. And here the architecture speaks again, not in grand monuments, but in repeating motifs. Domes, cupolas, metallic finials, star-shaped ornaments, peculiar roofline conductors, and symmetrical layouts that feel more like circuits than aesthetics. You've heard the term atmospheric electricity tossed around like a campfire ghost story, the idea that buildings once captured electrical potential from the air, from the ionosphere, from storms, from the gradient between earth and sky. Official academia will tell you this is nonsense, or at best a romantic misunderstanding of lightning rods. But pause and look with fresh eyes. Why so many domes? Why so many spires capped with metal points? Why the obsessive repetition of conductive-looking ornaments? Why the geometry of domes that seems tuned, as if resonance mattered? A dome is not just a roof, it's a geometry with properties. It focuses sound, it sheds wind, it distributes load. But it also creates a boundary condition, an enclosed volume that can behave like a cavity, like an instrument, like something meant to interact with fields. If you were a civilization fluent in subtle energies, electrostatics, resonance, pressure differentials, then you might design buildings that functioned as nodes, as collectors, as transformers. Not magic, engineering. The kind of engineering that disappears not because it was impossible, but because it was inconvenient to the next regime. Because if you can pull usable energy from the sky, you don't need a monopoly on coal, oil, pipelines, meters, billing systems. You don't need a centralized choke point. You need maintenance and knowledge, yes, but you don't need permission. And permission is the currency of empires. This is where ancient logistics becomes more than a phrase. Official historians love to marvel at how 19th century cities somehow moved impossible quantities of stone, raised colossal buildings, installed massive sewer networks, and did it all with horses and muscle. They'll describe it with a kind of nostalgic awe, as if wonder is a substitute for mechanism. But the scale of these projects, especially if we accept that many basements were once ground floors, suggests an infrastructure that was already in place. A logistics system that looks less like improvisation and more like inheritance. If a pre-reset world had standardized modules, hydraulic lifting, pressure-based transport, or field-assisted cranes, then the sudden burst of Victorian construction might not be a triumph of industrial genius, but the reoccupation of older shells. The new society moves in, renames everything, installs new clocks on old towers, declares a founding date, and calls it progress. Meanwhile, the lower floors, those inconvenient reminders of a previous ground level, get buried, repurposed, sealed, forgotten. And to make it stick, you don't need to erase every record. You just need to change the story people tell about the evidence they can still see. That's the heart of denial of the obvious. Not pretending the anomalies don't exist, but drowning them in explanations that sound reasonable enough to stop curiosity at the door. It was a basement. They raised the street. Fashion. Flooding. Settling. Nothing to see here. And when someone points to the repeating global pattern, the response is always fragmentation. Keep each anomaly local, isolated, harmless. Never let them form a network. Never let people compare notes across borders. Because the moment you connect Chicago's buried windows to St. Petersburg's sunken avenues, to Rome's lost levels, to India's half-submerged colonial facades, you risk the idea that the event was not local, it was global. And global events demand global explanations. Now comes the motive. Because every detective story needs one, and the motive here isn't cartoon villainy, it's governance. If there was a reset, someone managed it, or at least took advantage of it. In a shattered world after a catastrophe, mud, fire, flood, atmospheric collapse, whatever the mechanism, whoever controlled food, shelter, and narrative controlled the future. A population in shock will accept almost any story if it comes with bread and stability. So you consolidate, you standardize calendars, you rewrite maps, you rename streets, buildings, whole cities. You publish new textbooks. You build museums that display artifacts with labels that gently steer interpretation. You create an official timeline that turns the pre-reset world into a myth, a misdated antiquity, or a romantic classical past disconnected from living memory. And then you physically modify the evidence. You do it quietly, practically, under the banner of safety and modernization. You pour concrete over old floors. You install new sewer lines and claim the lower levels were unsanitary. You brick up arches and call it insulation. You pave over steps and call it traffic improvement. You let buildings burn when they're too revealing. Fires are wonderfully useful, historically speaking, because they destroy archives and invite reconstruction that can be updated. You encourage the demolition of ornate domes, replace metal finials with inert caps, strip conductive features under the pretense of repair. You change the skyline and with it the subconscious memory of what a city is supposed to look like. And if someone asks why, you point to economics, to technology, to the march of progress. You never say, we are severing the grid of atmospheric electricity. You never say, we are dismantling a system we don't want you to rediscover. You just smile and hand them a pamphlet. The strangest part is not that a conspiracy could exist. Humans conspire all the time. But how little conspiracy is needed when institutions have inertia. Institutional silence is often enough. Institutional silence doesn't require secret meetings in candlelit rooms. It requires a consensus of inconvenience. Researchers avoid topics that threaten grants. Archivists catalog what is asked for most. Teachers repeat what is easiest to test. Media amplifies what is safe. And slowly the world narrows to what can be printed without causing questions that don't have approved answers. That's how a reset becomes permanent, not by force alone, but by habituation. People stop expecting the past to be strange. They stop looking at old photographs like crime scenes. They stop asking why a basement has cathedral windows. They stop asking why the doors are so tall. They stop asking why the domes were everywhere and then suddenly weren't. They stop asking why certain records are abundant after a date and curiously patchy before it. They stop asking why the numbers in height registries behave like a system recovering from a shock rather than a population smoothly evolving. And then one day, a person like you sees the photograph again, and the spell breaks. Let's return to that buried windowed building, because every good mystery loops back to its first clue with new eyes. Imagine it not as a building that sank, but as a building that survived. Imagine the street level in the photo is not the original street, but the new surface laid down after the dump of mud and debris, after the leveling, after the quiet decision that the lower world would become off-limits. Those half windows might be the last visible edge of a buried floor plan, corridors, rooms, perhaps even mechanical spaces that once interfaced with a larger network. In some cities, when renovations expose these levels, workers report arched doorways leading to sealed passages, staircases that go nowhere, strange ventilation shafts, heavy iron brackets embedded in stone, patterns of tiling that don't match the era above. These are not proof of giants or ether energy by themselves. Critical thinking matters. But they are consistent with the hypothesis. There was more city below, more function, more continuity. And then the question of scale returns. If the old world used atmospheric electricity, then the reset wasn't just an accident, it was an opportunity to switch energy regimes. A sky-harvesting civilization is decentralized by nature. A fossil fuel civilization is centralized by design. One produces autonomy, the other produces dependency. So if you're the new power, what do you choose? You choose the regime that makes you indispensable. You choose the one you can meter, tax, ration, weaponize. You don't have to invent it from scratch, you just have to steer society into it while the old systems are offline or dismantled. You frame domes as decorative, not functional. You frame spires as religious, not technological. You frame geometric residence as aesthetic, not engineered. You reduce the geometry of domes to style, and in doing so you erase a whole language of design. And when someone notices that domes cluster on old civic buildings, courthouses, stations, libraries, and wonders why, you offer an easy answer: because it looked nice. That's the genius of a cover story. It's not absurd, it's just shallow enough to stop deeper digging. So we end where we began, in front of the photograph, listening to the hum of questions under the surface. The building stands, silent witness, with its half-buried arches like eyes peeking from a grave. The people in the image look ordinary, but their city doesn't. Their doors are wrong, their ground is wrong, their proportions are wrong, and the more you learn, the more the wrongness begins to rhyme across continents. You can keep calling it coincidence, or you can do what detectives do, follow the pattern, even when it leads into places polite society doesn't like to visit. Because the real mystery isn't whether a single building has windows in the ground. The real mystery is why so many do, why the explanation is always local when the evidence is global, why the 19th century reads like a recovery period after a shock, and why the mechanisms that could explain it, pressure shifts, gravity-like changes, lost engineering, pre-existing logistics, are treated as taboo rather than topics for investigation. That taboo is the loudest clue of all. It is the sound of a door being quietly locked. And now, with that sound in your ears, you have to decide what to do with the last, lingering question, the one that should haunt you long after the audio ends. If the world really did become heavier, if the tall ones couldn't survive the new load, if the lower floors were buried to hide an older normal, if atmospheric electricity and ancient logistics were dismantled to enforce a new dependency, then what else in plain sight is being explained away with denial of the obvious? And when you look at the buildings around you tomorrow, will you still believe you're standing on the first floor, or will you start to wonder what's underneath?